Before we begin, imagine an unemployed father who saves a little girl falling from a tree, only to discover her mother is a famous millionaire lawyer. What happens next will change both of their lives forever. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more heartwarming tales every day. Daniel had always thought of himself as resilient, but nothing had tested that resilience more than the silence of his small apartment, a silence made heavier by the stack of unpaid bills sitting on the kitchen counter and the empty chair where his daughter used to eat cereal before school. He had lost his last job after an accident on a construction site left his arm in a brace from wrist to elbow, and without steady work, his days blurred together into a haze of searching, rejection, and exhaustion. He told himself he had made the right choice years ago when he gave custody of Lily to her mother so she would have stability, but that choice didn't erase the hollow ache every time he saw her picture on his phone. That night, trudging home through the park to shave off 10 minutes from the long walk, he felt the cold air cutting into his lungs. The wind rattled the bare branches, and the snow crunched beneath his boots. He wasn't expecting anything to change. He wasn't expecting his life to turn at all. But as he passed the old oak in the park center, he heard a sound too heavy for a bird, too sudden to ignore, and then he saw it. A small figure slipping from a branch. He didn't stop to think. Instinct threw him forward, knees crashing into the snow as he caught the child's small body with his good arm. She was unconscious, her dark hair splayed across her pale face, a streak of red already seeping into the snow beneath her head. Hey, you're okay," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking, though he knew she couldn't hear him. He tore off his scarf, packed it with snow, and pressed it gently against the wound as he dialed emergency services with trembling fingers. The dispatcher's voice anchored him as he followed instructions step by step, his heart pounding louder with each passing second. The park around him was empty, eerily still, as though the world had narrowed to just him, the little girl, and the cold. When the sirens finally pierced the silence, Daniel felt relief rush through him so powerfully he nearly collapsed. Paramedics hurried over, swift and precise, lifting the girl onto a stretcher. One of them asked, "Are you her father?" And Daniel, still on his knees in the snow, shook his head and muttered, "No, I just found her." He couldn't explain why he followed them into the ambulance. Maybe it was the way the girl's small sneakers, one lace frayed, dangled off the stretcher. Maybe it was because walking away felt like abandoning her when she had no one else. As the vehicle jolted forward, Daniel gripped the bench with his left hand and stared at her, feeling the strange weight of responsibility for someone he didn't even know. At the hospital, the doors swallowed her into the emergency ward, leaving him alone in the waiting area that smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. He sat with his thoughts circling around Lily, imagining how terrified he would be if she were hurt and alone, how much he would want a stranger not to leave her side. That thought kept him rooted to the chair when every practical part of him said he should just go home. Time passed strangely under the fluorescent lights. Minutes stretched into hours, and Daniel's nerves frayed until finally a doctor emerged with measured words. Concussion, laceration, observation required. Relief came in fragments, careful and cautious, but Daniel clung to it, as if it were the only solid ground left. He rubbed absently at the edge of his brace, memories of the accident flashing unwanted across his mindboard, snapping, the shock of hitting the ground, the supervisor insisting, "You're not in the system yet," as if that erased the pain. He tried to focus on the girl instead, hoping she would wake soon, hoping her family would appear. And then the waiting room doors opened again, and everything shifted. A woman burst in, her expression frantic, her voice cracking as she cried out, "Where is my daughter?" Two men in tailored suits flanked her, scanning the room with alert, sharp gazes. Daniel knew instantly it was her, the girl's mother. She looked like she had run through every fear in the world just to reach this place, her hands trembling as she gripped the reception desk. One of the men spoke quietly with the nurse, then turned and locked eyes with Daniel. "You're the one who found her?" he asked, not warm, not accusing, simply demanding facts. Daniel nodded and explained how he had seen the fall, called for help, and stayed. The man listened, then said, "Her name is Mia." The mother's shoulders shook at the sound of it, tears spilling freely now. Daniel offered nothing but his presence, not knowing what words could possibly fit into grief that raw. Later, When he brought her a paper cup of coffee with a helpless little smile, she took it with both hands and whispered, "Thank you." And in that fragile moment, Daniel felt the weight of his lonely life shift in a way he couldn't yet understand. Daniel remained in the hospital long after most people would have gone home. The sterile chairs dug into his back, the hum of machines and distant beeping filling the silence as the hours stretched. He told himself he should leave. This wasn't his child. This wasn't his responsibility, but each time he stood, his feet felt glued to the floor. He pictured Mia waking up scared and alone, and something in him rebelled against the thought. Across the room, her mother sat between the two suited men, her hands twisting in her lap, her expensive coat still damp from melted snow. She looked like a woman who had everything and yet, in that moment, had nothing at all. Daniel caught her eye once, briefly, but looked away quickly. He wasn't sure what she saw in him, an exhausted stranger in worn clothes with a brace on his arm, but he knew what he saw in her. The raw, desperate fear of a parent who almost lost the thing she loved most. When the doctor finally returned, the news was merciful. Mia had a concussion, but no permanent damage. She would need observation, blood transfusions, and rest, but she would recover. Relief swept through the waiting area like a tide. The woman Laura, he heard one of the men call her, pressed her hands to her mouth, shoulders trembling as tears streamed down her cheeks. She turned to Daniel, eyes shimmering, and whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head gently, murmuring, "I'm just glad I was there." One of the men, his voice edged with suspicion, added, "You didn't have to come here at all." Daniel's gaze drifted to the closed doors of the ward, and he answered simply, "I know." It was the only explanation he could give. The next day, Daniel tried to slip back into his routine, though routine was nothing more than long walks, fruitless job applications, and the constant shadow of bills piling higher on his kitchen table. The accident had left him unable to do the heavy labor he once relied on, and no one wanted to hire a man who couldn't use both arms fully. His evenings were the hardest. He missed Lily with a gnawing ache, her laughter in the hallways, the way she used to curl up against him for cartoons. But every time he thought of Mia, unconscious in the snow, he told himself he had done something right, even if his own life felt broken. He tried to sleep that night, though the silence of his apartment pressed in like a weight. 2 days later, a sleek black car pulled up outside his small building. Daniel watched from the window, confused, as Laura stepped out, her presence unmistakable. She looked out of place against the cracked sidewalk and peeling paint, but there was no judgment in her eyes, only determination. When Daniel opened the door, she smiled faintly, as though rehearsing words she hadn't been able to say before. "I didn't thank you properly," she said softly. "That night, I was too panicked to find the right words. You saved my daughter." Daniel, awkward and unsure, shifted his weight. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she replied firmly. "Not everyone would have stayed." Her gaze fell to his brace. "What happened to your arm?" Daniel hesitated, then admitted the truth. He told her about the accident at the construction site, the faulty guardrails, the supervisor's negligence, and the way the company had shrugged off responsibility because his paperwork was incomplete. He explained how he lost his income and how every attempt to find work since had ended in rejection. His voice was steady, but the humiliation burned under the surface. Laura listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and when he finished, she simply said, "I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened to you." She glanced around the dim little apartment, her eyes lingering on the stack of bills by the counter, but she didn't comment. Instead, she thanked him again quietly and left, the sound of the luxury car fading into the distance. Daniel stood at the door long after she was gone, wondering why her presence had unsettled him so deeply. Weeks passed, and Daniel tried to push the memory aside, but one morning a thick envelope arrived by post. His stomach dropped when he saw the courthouse seal stamped across the front. Hands shaking, he opened it, scanning legal words he didn't understand. Panic welled in his chest. He had no lawyer, no money, no way to defend himself. Desperate, he scrolled through his phone and found the number Laura had given him when she left, almost as an afterthought. His voice cracked with shame when she answered. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't know what this means. I got papers from the court." For a moment there was silence. Then Laura's voice came through, calm but charged with something he couldn't name. "That she said firmly, is the date of your victory. I meant to tell you sooner, but it looks like the papers did it first. I've filed suit against the company on your behalf. You're not fighting this alone anymore. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed that night. The court papers spread across his knees like a weight he couldn't lift. His apartment was so quiet he could hear the hum of the old refrigerator in the next room, the tick of the radiator that never fully warmed the place. He rubbed his face with his free hand, shame burning in his chest. All his life he had taught himself to endure, to push forward no matter what. But the sight of legal documents filled with words he barely understood made him feel like a child again, powerless and cornered. His first instinct had been to ignore them, to stuff the envelope in a drawer and pretend it didn't exist. But the thought of losing even the little stability he had left was unbearable. That was when he called Laura, voice rough, heart racing. Her calm reply had felt like a lifeline thrown across an ocean he thought he would drown in. That's not a threat, she had told him, her tone steady. That's the start of your justice. I filed it, and I'll fight it. The days that followed were a blur of nerves. Daniel had never stepped inside a courtroom except on television, and the idea of standing there while lawyers argued over his life left him sleepless. But Laura carried herself with the composure of someone who lived in that world. She met him before the hearing, greeting him not with the cool detachment of a professional, but with the steady presence of someone who saw his fear and refused to let it consume him. Just tell the truth, she reminded him gently as they walked into the courthouse side by side. The rest is my job. And when they entered the chamber, her confidence seemed to radiate, filling the cold, echoing space with a kind of invisible shield. Daniel sat stiffly, eyes lowered, but every time he looked at her, he felt some of the weight slide from his shoulders. The company's representatives tried to twist the story, speaking of paperwork and technicalities, but Laura's voice cut through their arguments like a blade. She spoke of duty, negligence, and the price of human dignity. She painted the picture of a man who had worked 2 jobs to provide for his daughter, who had risked everything to give her stability, and who had been cast aside when he was hurt. Daniel watched in awe, hearing parts of his life turned into something powerful, something undeniable. It felt strange to hear his pain turned into evidence, his struggles laid bare not as shame, but as proof of injustice. He sat there trembling, not from fear but from the sheer force of realizing he was being defended, truly defended for the first time in his life. When the verdict came, it felt unreal. The judge's words rang out, awarding Daniel a settlement that far exceeded anything he had dared to imagine. The number echoed in his mind, almost incomprehensible. Enough to pay his debts, enough to cover Lily's education, enough to finally stop living one breath away from disaster. His throat tightened, eyes stinging with tears he hadn't planned to shed in public. Laura turned to him, her expression calm but her eyes glistening, and whispered, "You don't have to carry it all alone anymore." He nodded wordlessly, unable to trust his voice, and for the first time in years, hope felt heavier than despair. Weeks later, the weight of poverty had eased in ways Daniel hadn't thought possible. His kitchen table was no longer buried under unpaid bills. He could buy groceries without counting coins. When Lily visited, he no longer felt the shame of an empty fridge or a cold apartment. But beyond the money, what lingered most was the image of Laura standing in that courtroom, fierce and unshakable, fighting as though his struggle mattered as much as her own. One afternoon, as winter softened into early spring, Laura brought Mia to the park where it had all begun. Daniel watched the little girl run through the grass, her laughter bright and alive. And when he looked back at Laura, he saw something in her gaze he hadn't expected recognition. "You saved her," she said softly. "And I know what it means to raise a child alone. You don't have to be alone anymore." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them carried everything: gratitude, understanding, the possibility of something new. As Mia's laughter echoed, Laura slipped her hand into his, and Daniel realized that sometimes salvation doesn't come with sirens or settlements. Sometimes it comes in the quiet, unexpected way 2 lives intertwine, turning pain into a chance for love. Daniel's life began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways after the trial. For years, he had trained himself to live in survival mode, to measure every purchase, every choice, against the weight of what it might cost tomorrow. Now, for the first time in as long as he could remember, tomorrow didn't feel like a threat. The settlement had cleared his debts, and the constant knot of fear in his stomach had loosened. But more than the money, what had stayed with him was the memory of Laura standing at his side, unwavering, her voice cutting through the courtroom like truth made flesh. He replayed that image in quiet moments, wondering why it mattered so much. Perhaps because for the first time, someone powerful had stood for him, not out of obligation, not for a fee, but out of a choice born from gratitude and something deeper. It unsettled him and comforted him all at once. One weekend, when Lily came to visit, Daniel finally let himself do something he hadn't done in years. He bought her a gift without counting every coin in his pocket. A new set of paints, bright colors that lit up her eyes when she unwrapped them. She hugged him fiercely, paint-stained fingers leaving smudges on his shirt, and whispered, "I missed this, Dad." He swallowed hard, holding her tight, because it wasn't just the gift, it was being able to give her joy without guilt, to let her feel the kind of childhood moments he had feared he was stealing from her. That night, after she fell asleep on the couch, Daniel sat watching her chest rise and fall, realizing how much he had measured his worth through the lens of failure. Now, for once, he could imagine being enough. A week later, Laura invited him and Lily to her home. The invitation had come simply, a casual suggestion over the phone, but Daniel hesitated before accepting. He knew her world was nothing like his. When the day came, he and Lily stood on the steps of a house that looked more like a small palace, with tall windows and manicured gardens. Lily's eyes widened, whispering, "Dad, are we really allowed to be here?" Daniel smiled nervously and knocked. The door opened to the warmth of laughter, the smell of fresh bread, and Laura standing there, not as the untouchable lawyer in heels and power suits, but as a mother, dressed simply, her face lit up with genuine welcome. Inside, Lily and Mia bonded instantly, two girls from different worlds discovering they both loved the same silly cartoons and the same board game. Their giggles filled the halls, echoing in a way that softened every sharp edge of Daniel's doubts. Laura led him to the kitchen, poured coffee into mugs, and leaned against the counter. "I wanted you to see this part of my life," she said quietly, "because the night in the hospital, you saw me at my weakest. And in court, you saw me at my strongest. But this dash," she gestured to the sound of the girls laughing, "dash, this is the part that matters most." Daniel nodded, his throat tight, because he understood. He thought of Lily, how every sacrifice, every bruise on his hands, every sleepless night had been for her. And here was Laura, admitting the same truth, that strength and wealth meant nothing compared to the fragile love between parent and child. As the evening wore on, Laura watched Daniel interact with both girls, his patience, his gentleness, the way he never rushed their play but let them set the pace. Something inside her softened. She had seen many kinds of men, arrogant, ambitious, manipulative, but Daniel's quiet resilience, his devotion, stood out in a way money could never buy. When it was time to leave, she walked them to the car herself. Lily hugged Mia goodbye, promising they'd see each other soon, and Daniel extended his hand politely. But Laura shook her head and instead pulled him into a brief, warm embrace. "You don't know it yet," she whispered, "but you've given me as much as I've given you." Daniel drove away that night with Lily asleep in the back seat, the city lights flickering past, and for the first time in years, his chest ached not with despair, but with the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of hope. Daniel found himself thinking about that evening at Laura's home far more often than he expected. For years he had built emotional walls around himself, teaching his heart that safety came from silence, from not asking, from not expecting. But now, in quiet moments, he remembered the way Laura's arms had felt around him, the warmth in her voice when she said he had given her something too. It unsettled him because he didn't know what it meant, and yet it was the first time in years he had allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't defined solely by survival. Even his small apartment felt different these days, less like a cage, more like a waiting room for something better. He cooked more, he cleaned with a kind of pride, and when Lily visited, she noticed. "You smile more, Dad," she said one evening, paintbrush in her hand. Daniel ruffled her hair, embarrassed, but deep down he knew she was right. Laura began to appear in his life in small, surprising ways. Sometimes she would call to check how his arm was healing. Sometimes she would send me his drawings, little crayon sketches with messy handwriting at the bottom that said, thank you. And sometimes, when their schedules aligned, they would meet at the park so the girls could play together. At first, Daniel stood at a distance, unsure if he fit into Laura's world. But over time, he noticed how naturally she treated him, how she never looked down on him, never reminded him of the gap between their lives. Instead, she listened. When he spoke about his struggles, she didn't offer pity, she offered presence. That made all the difference. He had lived so long without anyone to lean on that her quiet steadiness felt like a miracle. One evening, after the girls had worn themselves out chasing each other through the park, Laura suggested they all have dinner together. Daniel hesitated. His instinct was to refuse, to avoid stepping into a world he didn't belong to, but Lily's eager eyes decided for him. They went to a quiet restaurant where the waiters recognized Laura immediately and treated her with reverence. Daniel felt out of place in his worn jacket, but Laura never once let him feel small. She asked Lily about her art, laughed at Mia's silly stories, and when Daniel spoke, she leaned in as though his words carried the same weight as any senator or celebrity she had represented. By the end of the night, the girls were asleep in the back seat of Laura's car, their heads resting on each other's shoulders, and Daniel found himself sitting beside Laura in a rare, comfortable silence. She glanced at him with a soft smile. "You know," she said, "I don't usually let people into my private life. But with you, it doesn't feel like letting someone in. It feels like finding something that was missing." Daniel didn't know how to respond. For so long, he had measured himself by what he lacked: money, stability, status, that hearing someone like Laura speak as though he brought value into her world left him speechless. That night, when he carried Lily up the stairs to his apartment and laid her in bed, he sat by her side for a long time, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, whispering a promise he had never dared to make before. Things are going to be better now. And for the first time, he believed it himself. Weeks turned into months, and their bond deepened in ways both simple and profound. They attended school events together, Mia's recital, Lily's art show, sitting side by side in crowded auditoriums. Laura invited Daniel to family gatherings, where her relatives eyed him curiously but softened when they saw how gently he treated both girls. Daniel, in turn, introduced Laura to his small circle of friends, the ones who had known him through his hardest years, and she earned their respect not through her wealth, but through her kindness. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the lines between their lives began to blur. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was steady, like the slow melting of winter into spring. One quiet evening, after the girls had gone to sleep during a movie marathon at Laura's house, Daniel and Laura found themselves alone in the kitchen. The room was dim, lit only by the warm underglow of the cabinets. Daniel leaned against the counter, his brace finally gone, though his arms still carried faint aches. Laura poured them both tea and set a cup in front of him. For a moment, they simply stood there, the silence comfortable. Then she spoke softly. "Do you realize how much has changed since that night in the park?" Daniel nodded slowly, eyes dropping to his cup. "I do. I think about it every day." She reached out, resting her hand over his. "I was afraid that night, more than I've ever been. But you reminded me what it feels like to trust someone, to not have to be strong alone." Daniel looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not just the powerful attorney or the wealthy woman, but a mother, a person who carried her own scars. His voice was low, rough with emotion. "You saved me too, Laura. You gave me back more than I ever thought I'd have." For a long time, neither of them moved. The world outside was quiet, the house still, as though holding its breath. And then, gently, Laura leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. No promises, no grand declarations, just the quiet acknowledgement of two souls finding each other in the wreckage of their pasts. In that moment, Daniel realized that this was what a second chance felt like. Not a dramatic rescue, but a slow, steady healing shared between two people who had learned how to survive alone and were now learning how to live together. Daniel woke early on the morning of the spring festival at Lily's school, sunlight spilling across the floor in a way that felt almost like a promise. He had always dreaded school events in the past, sitting alone in crowded auditoriums while other families gathered in pairs or groups. But this time was different. Laura had insisted on coming, and Mia had been buzzing with excitement about watching Lily's art project displayed in front of the whole class. As Daniel buttoned his shirt, his heart thudded with a nervousness he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. It wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about being seen, standing in the light of a new life he hadn't dared to believe he could have. When Laura arrived, stepping out of her car with Mia holding her hand, Daniel saw the way Lily's face lit up, as though her small world had suddenly become brighter. For the first time in years, he walked into that school not as a man carrying his shame, but as a father surrounded by a kind of family he thought he'd lost forever. Inside, the air smelled of crayons and polished floors, children's laughter echoing off the walls. Lily's project was a mural of a tree, its branches stretching wide, painted in bold colors. At the base of the tree, she had drawn a small figure with outstretched arms, holding another tiny figure safe from falling. Daniel froze when he saw it, the memory of that snowy night flashing sharp and clear. "That's you, Dad," Lily whispered proudly, tugging his sleeve. "You're the one who catches people." His throat tightened, and he blinked fast, hoping the tears wouldn't fall in front of everyone. Laura, standing just behind him, placed her hand lightly on his back. Her touch was steady, grounding him in the moment. He glanced at her, and the look in her eyes soft, full of quiet admiration spoke volumes. She had seen countless victories in her career, but this small mural felt like one of the greatest triumphs. After the event, the four of them spilled out into the sunshine. Mia and Lily skipped ahead, hands clasped, their laughter carrying across the playground. Laura and Daniel followed at a slower pace. "She sees you as her hero," Laura said gently. Daniel gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I've spent years feeling like anything but." Laura stopped walking, her gaze locking onto his. "You are," she said firmly. "Not because you caught her, but because you've kept showing up, even when life gave you every reason not to." Her words sank into him, deeper than she could know. For so long, he had defined himself by what he had failed to provide, what he had lost. Hearing her say it out loud, with conviction, made something inside him unclench. That evening, Daniel invited Laura and Mia over to his apartment for the first time. It was modest, still carrying the wear of years of struggle, but he had tidied every corner and even set out Lily's paintings along the walls to bring warmth into the space. He expected Laura to notice the peeling paint or the worn furniture, but instead she walked slowly through the rooms, pausing to study each of Lily's drawings with a smile. "This place has love in it," she murmured, and Daniel felt his chest swell with a strange mix of pride and relief. They ate together at his small table, the girls giggling over a shared joke, and for a moment Daniel simply sat back, letting the sound wash over him. It was the kind of simple, ordinary night he had always wanted for Lily, a night filled with laughter, warmth, and the feeling of belonging. When the girls finally fell asleep, curled up side by side on the couch under a single blanket, Daniel and Laura sat quietly with mugs of tea. The room glowed softly in the lamplight, shadows dancing across the walls. Daniel turned the mug in his hands, searching for words. "I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted. "Not just the money or the safety. I mean, family, the feeling of it." Laura leaned closer, her voice tender. "I know. I spent years thinking success would fill that emptiness, but it never did. Then you came along, and I realized that what I was missing wasn't more victories, it was someone who understood." Her eyes shimmered as she reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "You saved my daughter, Daniel. But you also reminded me how to be a mother, how to let love in again." In that fragile, luminous moment, Daniel realized that second chances didn't arrive with grand gestures. They arrived quietly, in painted murals, in laughter around a worn kitchen table, in the simple weight of someone's hand resting over yours. He squeezed Laura's hand gently, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. "You saved me too," he whispered. They sat there, the silence between them no longer heavy, but alive with possibility. In the other room, the soft breathing of the girls was the steady rhythm of a new life beginning. And as Daniel leaned forward, meeting Laura's gaze, he knew that the long road of struggle had led him here not to despair, but to a home he hadn't known he was searching for. The past was still part of him, but the future, at last, was theirs to share.